What happens when the accuser becomes the accused? The conductor's hand froze mid-gesture, 2,400 pairs of eyes locked onto the solitary figure seated at the Steinway grand piano. Jordan Hayes sat motionless, her fingers hovering just above the ivory keys, the weight of every breath in Chicago Symphony Center pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. In the front row, Dr. Richard Caldwell leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd been waiting for this moment. The moment when this young upstart would finally be exposed as the fraud he'd always known her to be. But what was about to unfold in the next hour would shock everyone in that hall. What Jordan was about to do wouldn't just prove her innocence. It would reveal a truth so devastating that it would shatter the career of one of classical music's most powerful figures. The question wasn't whether Jordan Hayes could play. The question was, how did a 27-year-old pianist from Chicago's South Side end up here fighting for her reputation in front of thousands about to turn the tables in a way no one could have predicted to understand that we need to go back to where it all began. 20 years earlier, on a sweltering July afternoon, 7-year-old Jordan Hayes heard something that would change her life forever. She'd been walking past the old community center on 47th Street, cutting through the South Side neighborhood on her way home from the corner store, when a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was music, but unlike anything she'd ever heard before. Not the hip-hop that blasted from passing cars, not the gospel that flooded out of churches on Sunday mornings. This was something else entirely. Piano music. Classical piano music. Jordan pressed her face against the dusty window of the community center's basement. Inside, she could see an older woman, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, seated at an upright piano that had seen better days. The woman's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed almost magical to young Jordan. She didn't know it then, but she was watching Miss Dorothy Grant, a retired piano teacher who volunteered at the center twice a week, trying to keep classical music alive in a neighborhood where survival often took precedence over scales and sonatas. Jordan stood there for the entire hour, transfixed. When Ms. Grant finally finished and looked up, she saw the small face in the window, eyes wide with wonder. "You like that, baby?" Ms. Grant called out, opening the door. Jordan nodded, unable to find words. You want to try Jordan's heart hammered in her chest. She'd never touched a piano before. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Her father had left when she was 3. There was no money for music lessons, no money for instruments. The piano might as well have been on the moon. But Ms. Grant saw something in that 7-year-old's eyes, something she'd spent 30 years as a music teacher learning to recognize. Hunger. Not for food, though Jordan knew that hunger too. This was different. This was hunger of the soul. "Come on in," Ms. Grant said, holding the door open wider. Jordan's small hands trembled as she approached the piano. Ms. Grant guided her to sit on the bench, showed her where to place her fingers. "Now just press this key right here," Ms. Grant said softly, pointing to middle C. Jordan pressed down. The note sang out clear and pure, filling the small basement room. And something inside Jordan Hayes clicked into place. Something fundamental, something that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. "Again," Ms. Grant said. Jordan pressed the key again, and again, and again. "Good," Ms. Grant smiled. "Now let me show you something beautiful." Over the next 10 years, that dusty basement became Jordan's sanctuary. Every day after school, she'd race to the community center. Ms. Grant would be there waiting, ready to pour decades of knowledge into this eager student who absorbed everything like a sponge. They couldn't afford the fancy books, the prestigious academies, the private lessons that cost hundreds of dollars an hour. But they had something more valuable: time dedication, and a shared love for the music itself. Ms. Grant taught her the classics: Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin. But she also taught her something else, something that would later define Jordan's unique voice as an artist. Classical music wasn't born in Vienna, Ms. Grant would say. Music is music. It flows through all of us regardless of where we're from. The spirituals your grandmother sang in church, the blues that built this city, the jazz that made it famous, that's all part of the same river. Don't you ever let anyone tell you there's only one way to make music speak. Jordan absorbed this lesson as deeply as she absorbed the technical skills. Her fingers learned to navigate Rachmaninoff's impossible reaches, but they also learned the syncopations of Thelonious Monk. She could play a Chopin nocturne with perfect classical precision, but she could also make the same piano growl with the raw emotion of gospel music. By the time she was 16, Jordan had won every local competition available to her. Small contests with modest prizes, but each one was a victory that proved she belonged in a world that hadn't seen many people who looked like her. The classical music world was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly wealthy, overwhelmingly connected to resources Jordan would never have. But she had something they didn't, a fire that had been lit in that basement at age 7 and had never stopped burning. A scholarship to the Chicago Conservatory came when she was 17. Full ride, a chance to study with world-class teachers to practice on Steinways instead of the beaten-up upright in the community center basement. Her mother cried when the letter arrived. Ms. Grant smiled that knowing smile and said, "I told you, baby, your voice is special. No one can teach that. That comes from in here." She tapped Jordan's chest right over her heart. At the conservatory, Jordan thrived. While other students struggled with the pressure, the competition, the cutthroat environment where everyone was fighting to be noticed, Jordan just played. She played like she'd always played, with complete honesty, with total commitment to the music itself. Her performances began attracting attention. Critics called her technique flawless, and her interpretations refreshingly original. She won the Midwest Young Artists Competition at 22, the Beethoven Society Prize at 24, the American Piano Awards at 25. Every success brought her closer to the big leagues. The major concert halls, the international tours, the recording contracts. She was on the verge of becoming something rare, a classical pianist who came from nothing and made it to the top on pure talent. But success also brought something else: scrutiny, jealousy, and eventually the attention of Dr. Richard Caldwell. Grant's words echoed in her mind during those years. "Music is truth, Jordan. It cannot lie. When you sit at that piano, you tell the truth. Always. That's what makes you special. Your truth cannot be copied. Your voice cannot be stolen." Jordan carried those words with her as she prepared for the biggest opportunity of her young career, the Chicago International Piano Competition. The competition that could launch her into the stratosphere. The competition that would put her on stages from Carnegie Hall to the Royal Albert Hall. The competition where she would meet Dr. Richard Caldwell, and where everything would nearly fall apart. Dr. Richard Caldwell was classical music royalty. For 30 years, his reviews in Musical America and the Classical Review had made and broken careers. Conductors sought his approval. Concert halls courted his favor. Young musicians lived in terror of his cutting critiques. He'd written 15 books on music theory. He'd lectured at every major conservatory in the world. His opinion wasn't just respected, it was treated as gospel truth. Caldwell had been a pianist himself once upon a time, a promising student at Juilliard in the early 1980s. But something had happened. He'd never quite made it as a performer. The technique was there, colleagues remembered, but something was missing. That indefinable quality that separates a good pianist from a great one. That spark, that voice. So he'd pivoted to criticism. And in criticism, he'd found power. The power to elevate, the power to destroy, the power to decide who belonged in the classical music world and who didn't. He was 58 now, with silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suits tailored to perfection, and the bearing of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in positions of authority. He spoke in measured tones, chose his words carefully, and never ever admitted to being wrong. And he had very specific ideas about what constituted authentic classical music. It happened at a master class 3 months before the Chicago International Piano Competition. Jordan had been invited to perform as part of a series hosted by the conservatory. It was an honor only the most promising students were selected. The master class would be led by guest artists, and this particular session would be overseen by Dr. Richard Caldwell himself. Jordan chose to play her own arrangement of a Bach fugue, interwoven with improvisational elements that drew from jazz harmonies. It was risky, unconventional, but it was purely her. It showcased everything that made her unique as an artist. She poured herself into the performance. The audience of students and faculty sat in rapt attention. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, that beautiful, pregnant silence that every performer dreams of before applause filled the hall. But Caldwell didn't clap. He sat in his chair on the stage, hands folded, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When the applause died down, he stood slowly. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Very interesting indeed." Jordan felt a chill run down her spine. Something in his tone wasn't right. "Tell me," Ms. Hayes Caldwell continued, walking slowly toward the piano. "Where exactly did you study this particular interpretation?" I created it myself," Dr. Caldwell Jordan replied. "It's my own arrangement. Your own arrangement." He repeated the words as if tasting something unpleasant. "I see. And the improvisational elements, those are also your creation." "Yes, sir." Caldwell stopped a few feet from the piano, his eyes boring into hers. "That's quite remarkable. You see, I heard echoes of Gould's Bach recordings in your phrasing, elements of Keith Jarrett's improvisational style in your harmonies, even some of Bill Evans in those left-hand voicings. All of these masters somehow channeled through your fingers. Quite remarkable indeed." The audience murmured. Jordan's mouth went dry. "Dr. Caldwell, I'm certainly influenced by many pianists, but influenced," he cut her off. "Yes, that's one word for it. Another word might be derivative. Or perhaps in less generous terms, imitative." The room fell silent. This wasn't constructive criticism. This was an accusation. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, of course," Caldwell continued, though his tone suggested precisely that. "It's just that true originality is so rare. So very rare. Especially in someone so young. So relatively inexperienced. One wonders if what we're hearing is genuine creativity, or simply a very skillful patchwork of influences that haven't been properly acknowledged." Jordan felt heat rising in her cheeks. Around the hall, students were exchanging glances. Faculty members looked uncomfortable. "Dr. Caldwell," one of the professors interjected. "I think I'm simply raising a question," Caldwell said smoothly. "A question that I think deserves serious consideration. In classical music, we have standards, we have traditions, we have authenticity. and we must be vigilant in protecting those standards from those who would cut corners. He turned to leave the stage, then paused and looked back at Jordan. A word of advice, Ms. Hayes. If you're going to compete at the highest levels, and I understand you're registered for the Chicago International competition, you might want to ensure that everything you present is truly unequivocally your own work. Judges at that level have excellent memories. They've heard everything. They'll know if you're offering them something genuine or something borrowed. He walked off the stage, leaving Jordan sitting at the piano, her hands shaking, her mind reeling. What had just happened? If Jordan had hoped that Caldwell's comments would be forgotten, she was quickly disappointed. 2 weeks later, he published a piece in Musical America titled "The Problem of Authenticity in Contemporary Performance." He didn't name Jordan specifically, but everyone in the classical music world knew who he was talking about. The article discussed the importance of originality in classical music. It raised concerns about young performers who relied too heavily on mimicking established artists. It questioned whether certain rising stars had truly earned their success or were simply skilled at copying the work of others. The piece went viral in classical music circles. Blogs picked it up. Social media erupted with debate. And slowly, insidiously, doubt began to creep into every conversation about Jordan Hayes. Had she really created that arrangement herself? Or had she borrowed more than she'd admitted? Was her unique style genuinely unique? Or was it just a clever combination of other people's ideas? Jordan tried to ignore it. She focused on her practice, on preparing for the Chicago competition. But the whispers followed her everywhere. Then Caldwell published a second article. This one was more direct. He'd done research, he claimed. He'd found troubling similarities between Jordan's improvisational style and recordings by several jazz pianists. He'd identified moments in her classical interpretations that seemed to echo specific performances by other artists. He didn't call it plagiarism. He was too sophisticated for that. He called it insufficient originality and questionable artistic independence. The damage was immediate and severe. 2 venues that had booked her for performances canceled. They were reevaluating their programming, the emails said. They needed to maintain the highest standards of artistic integrity. A recording contract that had been in negotiation fell through. The label wanted to wait and see how things develop. Most devastating of all 3 of the sponsors who'd been supporting her career withdrew their funding. They couldn't be associated with controversy, they explained. They needed to protect their reputations. Jordan watched her career crumbling in real time. Everything she'd worked for, everything she and Ms. Grant had built over 20 years, was being destroyed by one man's insinuations. She tried defending herself. She gave interviews explaining her creative process, describing how she'd developed her style. But Caldwell's reputation was too powerful. His word carried too much weight. When he cast doubt, people believed him. The classical music world had always been insular, always been protective of its traditions. And Caldwell was the ultimate insider, while Jordan was the outsider trying to break in. She should have quit. Any reasonable person would have quit. But Jordan Hayes hadn't become a classical pianist by being reasonable. She'd done it by being stubborn, by refusing to accept that some doors were closed to people like her. And something else was bothering her. Something about Caldwell's attacks felt personal, felt excessive. He wasn't just criticizing her music. He seemed to want to destroy her. Why? The question haunted her as the Chicago International piano competition approached. Should she even compete? Would anyone believe her performances were authentic? Or would Caldwell's accusations hang over every note she played? She was still wrestling with these questions when she received an unexpected phone call from the competition organizers. They had a proposal. one that would change everything. Jordan sat in her small apartment in Hyde Park, laptop open, scrolling through comment sections she knew she should avoid. Always wondered if she was too good to be true. Caldwell's right. Her playing sounds like a mashup of other pianists. Sad when young artists try to take shortcuts. Classical music deserves better. Each comment was a knife. Each doubt expressed was a wound. She'd spent her entire life proving she belonged, and now strangers on the internet were deciding she didn't. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "Baby, you okay?" Jordan wanted to say yes. She wanted to be strong like she'd always been strong. But something broke. "No, Mama, I'm not okay." Her mother listened as Jordan poured out everything. The accusations, the canceled performances, the sponsors who'd abandoned her, the creeping doubt that maybe somehow Caldwell was right. Maybe she wasn't as original as she thought. Maybe she was just a skilled mimic who'd fooled everyone, including herself. "That's the devil talking," her mother said firmly. "You know who you are. You know what's true. Don't let some bitter man steal that from you." But knowing the truth didn't matter if no one else believed it. After she hung up, Jordan sat at the old keyboard in her apartment. She couldn't afford a real piano, still practiced on the same electronic keyboard she'd bought, used when she was 16. She placed her fingers on the keys, but couldn't play. Every note felt contaminated by doubt. What if they were right? What if she'd been unconsciously copying other artists all along? What if her unique voice was just a lie she'd told herself? She closed the keyboard and lay down on her couch, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she should withdraw from the competition, save herself the humiliation of performing in front of judges who'd already decided she was a fraud. Sleep wouldn't come. Jordan's mind kept circling back to the same thoughts, the same doubts, the same fear that everything she'd built was about to collapse. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went to her bookshelf. On the bottom shelf, in a place of honor, sat 3 worn composition notebooks. Her practice journals from her years with Ms. Grant. Jordan pulled out the first one from when she was 8 years old. Ms. Grant had insisted she keep detailed notes about every practice session, every lesson, every insight she discovered. The handwriting was childish, the observations simple. But as Jordan flipped through the pages, she saw her younger self discovering music. Not imitating it, discovering it. "Today I figured out that if you play the black keys in a row, it sounds like raindrops. Ms. Grant showed me a Mozart piece. I tried to play it with feeling like church music. She smiled and said, 'That's good. That's finding my own way. I don't want to play like the people on Ms. Grant's recordings. I want to play like me, but I don't know what me sounds like yet.'" Jordan felt tears on her cheeks. That little girl hadn't been trying to copy anyone. She'd been trying to find her voice, her own voice. She pulled out the second notebook from age 12. Ms. Grant says all music is connected. She says Bach and the blues come from the same place, people trying to express what they feel. She says I should learn from everyone, but sound like no one but myself. And the third notebook from age 16. I'm scared to go to the conservatory. Everyone there will be better than me. Everyone will have had expensive teachers and perfect training. But Ms. Grant says I have something they don't. She says I have truth. She says when I play, I'm telling my truth, and nobody can copy that because it's mine. Jordan closed the notebook and held it to her chest. Grant had died 3 years ago peacefully in her sleep at age 78. Jordan had played at her funeral. A simple piece, a hymn that Ms. Grant had taught her when she was 9 years old. She'd played it with all the love and gratitude in her heart. What would Ms. Grant say now? Jordan knew exactly what she'd say. She'd say, "Baby music doesn't lie. You know who you are. Now go show them." Jordan stood up, walked to her keyboard, and opened it. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. Not anything written, not anything she'd practiced. Just truth. Her truth. The music flowed out of her raw and honest. It was angry and sad and defiant all at once. It was every feeling she'd been holding inside since Caldwell's first accusation. It was her voice, undeniably hers, incapable of being anyone else's. When she finished, she knew what she had to do. She would compete. She would walk into that competition hall and she would play. Not to prove Caldwell wrong, though she would do that too, but to prove herself right. To honor Ms. Grant. To honor that 7-year-old girl who'd pressed her face against a dusty window and heard something that changed her life. The next morning, Jordan received an email from Margaret Sullivan, the director of the Chicago International Piano Competition. "Jordan, I hope this message finds you well. I've been following the recent controversy surrounding your work, and I want you to know that the competition committee believes in giving all our registered participants a fair chance. However, given the circumstances, we need to address the concerns that have been raised. I'd like to propose a solution. Would you be available for a phone call this afternoon?" Jordan's stomach knotted. They were going to ask her to withdraw. They were going to tell her that Caldwell's accusations made her participation too controversial. But she called anyway. "Jordan, thank you for calling back," Margaret said. Her voice was kind, but professional. "I'm going to be direct with you. Dr. Caldwell's articles have created a situation that we need to address. Some members of our board are concerned about the competition's reputation. They're worried about being associated with controversy." Here it comes, Jordan thought. The polite rejection. "However," Margaret continued, "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've heard you play. I've watched you develop as an artist. And I don't believe for a second that you're anything other than authentic. But belief isn't enough. We need proof. Undeniable proof." "What kind of proof?" Jordan asked. "A live improvisation test. You would perform at the competition's opening gala in front of the judges, the board, the media, and about 2,000 audience members. We would give you 3 themes, one at a time, with no preparation time. You would need to improvise a piece based on each theme, creating original music in real time. It would be live-streamed, recorded, completely transparent." Jordan's heart hammered. "And if I refuse, then you're still welcome to compete in the traditional format. But the cloud of suspicion will remain. This is a chance to clear your name definitively. To prove beyond any doubt that your musical voice is authentically yours. Will Dr. Caldwell be there?" There was a pause. "He's been invited as an expert observer. He's accepted." Of course he had. He'd want to be there to watch her fail. "If I do this," Jordan said slowly, "and I prove myself, what happens to Caldwell's accusations? If you succeed, they become irrelevant. The classical music world respects live performance above all else. Improvisation can't be faked. It can't be copied. It's the ultimate test of original musicianship." Jordan thought about Ms. Grant, about that 7-year-old girl, about every hour of practice, every small victory, every moment of doubt she'd overcome. "I'll do it," she said. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Jordan's life. She practiced improvisation for 8 hours a day. Not by preparing specific pieces that would defeat the purpose, but by training her mind to create music spontaneously, to translate emotion and concept into sound in real time. She returned to the community center on 47th Street, to the old upright piano where she'd learned to play. It felt right to prepare there, in the place where it all began. Young students would sometimes watch her practice. She'd smile at them, remember herself at their age hungry for something she couldn't name, but knew she needed. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, approached her after a particularly intense practice session. "You play pretty?" the girl said shyly. Jordan knelt down to her level. "Thank you, sweetheart. Do you want to play piano?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Then remember something for me. Okay? When you play, you don't play to sound like anyone else. You play to sound like you. Can you remember that?" The girl nodded again, and Jordan saw herself in those wide, eager eyes. The night before the performance, Jordan couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing through all the things that could go wrong. What if she froze? What if the themes were impossible? What if Caldwell was right and she really didn't have anything original to say? At midnight, she got up and went to the window. Chicago spread out before her lights, twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere in this city, in some basement or community center or living room, there was probably a kid falling in love with music right now. A kid like she'd been. That kid deserved to see that it was possible. That you could come from nothing and make it to the top. That your voice mattered even if it didn't sound like everyone else's voice. Especially if it didn't sound like everyone else's voice. Jordan pressed her palm against the cool window glass. "Okay, Ms. Grant," she whispered. "I'm ready. Let's show them what we're made of." The evening of October 15th was unseasonably warm for Chicago. Jordan stood outside the Chicago Symphony Center, looking up at the grand building that had hosted legends. Horowitz had played here, Rubinstein, Gilels, and tonight, Jordan Hayes would either join their legacy or be destroyed in front of thousands. The media presence was overwhelming. News vans lined the street. Photographers jostled for position. This wasn't just a classical music event anymore. It had become a story about integrity, about truth, about whether a young black woman from the South Side could stand up to the classical music establishment and prove she belonged. Jordan took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. Inside the lobby buzzed with energy. 2,400 people had packed the hall. The competition's traditional gala attendance was usually around 500. But controversy had made this must-see entertainment. Jordan recognized faces from the classical music world. Critics, musicians, conservatory directors. All here to witness either her vindication or her destruction. And there near the front entrance, surrounded by admirers, stood Dr. Richard Caldwell. He was holding court, speaking in his measured tones to a circle of well-dressed patrons. When he saw Jordan, his eyes locked onto hers for just a moment. The smile he gave her was thin, predatory. He thought he'd already won. Margaret Sullivan found Jordan in the crowd. "You okay?" "No," Jordan admitted. "But I'm here. That's all that matters. Come on, let's get you backstage." Backstage, Jordan met the 5 judges who would evaluate her improvisation. Distinguished musicians, all ranging from a conductor of the Boston Symphony to a piano professor from Juilliard. They were polite but reserved. They'd maintain objectivity, their demeanor said. Margaret reviewed the format one final time. You'll receive 3 themes, one at a time. Each theme will be a single word, a concept you need to interpret musically. You'll have no preparation time. We need to see spontaneous creation. After each improvisation, the judges will briefly confer, then we'll move to the next theme. The entire process should take about 30 to 40 minutes. And Dr. Caldwell Jordan asked. He's seated in the front row as an expert observer. He won't be judging, but his observations will be noted. Of course they would be. One more thing, Margaret said, her voice softer. Jordan, no matter what happens tonight, you've already shown tremendous courage. You're here. You're facing this head-on. That's no small thing. Jordan nodded, not trusting herself to speak. A stage manager appeared. 5 minutes. This was it. No more preparation. No more practice. Everything she'd learned, everything Ms. Grant had taught her, it all came down to the next 40 minutes. The house lights dimmed. The audience settled into their seats, a wave of rustling fabric and whispered conversations slowly giving way to expectant silence. Margaret walked onto the stage, a spotlight following her to the microphone at center stage. Behind her, a Steinway Model D concert grand piano gleamed under the lights, waiting. "Good evening," Margaret's voice filled the hall. "Thank you all for joining us for this special presentation. Tonight we have the privilege of witnessing something rare, a live demonstration of pure musical creativity. Ms. Jordan Hayes has agreed to participate in an improvisation challenge that will showcase the originality and authenticity of her musical voice." Jordan stood in the wings listening. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure the audience must be able to hear it. "The rules are simple," Margaret continued. "Ms. Hayes will receive 3 themes, single words representing concepts she must interpret through spontaneous musical composition. She will have no preparation time. What you hear tonight will be created in real time in this moment, nowhere else. This is the ultimate test of original artistry." The audience murmured with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ms. Jordan Hayes." The spotlight swung to the wings. Jordan forced her legs to move. One step, then another. The walk to the piano felt like miles. 2,400 faces watched her. 2,400 people waited to see if she would rise or fall. Among them, Dr. Richard Caldwell sat with his arms crossed, that same thin smile on his face. Jordan reached the piano, sat down on the bench, adjusted the height, placed her hands lightly on her lap. The Steinway was perfect, of course. Concert grands always were. The keys would be perfectly weighted, the action smooth, the tone rich and clear. This wasn't the upright in the community center basement. This wasn't her cheap electronic keyboard. This was a $3 million instrument that demanded excellence. She looked out at the audience, at all those expectant faces at Caldwell, waiting for her to fail at the judges with their clipboards and professional detachment. Then she closed her eyes. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard Ms. Grant's voice, as clear as if the old woman was sitting right beside her. "Music doesn't lie, baby. Just tell your truth." Jordan opened her eyes. She nodded to Margaret. Margaret opened an envelope and pulled out a card. She walked to the microphone. "The first theme," she announced, "is storm." The word echoed through the hall. Storm. Jordan's hands moved to the keys, and she began to play. At first, there was only a whisper. Jordan's right hand played high on the keyboard, delicate notes, like the first drops of rain, gentle and tentative. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear. The left hand joined low notes that rumbled like distant thunder. The right hand's rain grew more insistent drops, becoming sheets, a light shower becoming a downpour. The tempo increased, gradually building tension. Jordan's fingers danced across the keys, creating patterns that mimicked wind through trees, the rustle and howl of a growing tempest. She drew on her classical training. There was Liszt in the fury Rachmaninoff, in the dark power of the storm's approach. But there was also something else, something that came from deeper inside her. The storm broke. Both hands attacked the keyboard with controlled violence, creating wall after wall of sound. It was chaos, but purposeful chaos. It was nature's fury, translated into music. The audience could hear lightning strikes in the sudden sharp chords, could feel the pounding of rain in the rapid-fire notes. But Jordan didn't just create sound effects. She created emotion. This wasn't just a storm outside, it was the storm inside, the turbulence of fear, the chaos of doubt, the violence of other people's accusations tearing at your sense of self. She was playing her life. The storm reached its peak, all fury and power, and then slowly, gradually, the violence subsided. The rain softened. The thunder grew distant. The wind died down. Jordan's hands gentled on the keys, returning to those high, delicate notes from the beginning. But they were different now. Changed. Like the air after a storm, cleansed and renewed. The last note faded into silence. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the applause began. Not polite, classical music applause, real applause. People were on their feet. Not all of them, but enough. They'd heard something genuine, something powerful, something that couldn't be faked or copied or borrowed. Jordan looked at the judges. They were writing notes, conferring quietly. She couldn't read their expressions. Then she looked at Caldwell. His arms were still crossed, but the smile was gone. His face was neutral now, giving nothing away. Margaret returned to the microphone, waited for the applause to fade. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Judges, your preliminary assessment." The head judge, Dr. Patricia Morrison from Juilliard, spoke into her microphone. "Original, technically proficient, emotionally coherent. We'll reserve final judgment until all 3 improvisations are complete." Margaret nodded and opened the second envelope. The second theme Margaret announced is memory. Memory. Jordan closed her eyes again. Let the word sink in. What memory would she choose? What truth would she tell? Her hands found the keys, and suddenly she was 7 years old again. The opening was simple, almost childlike, a melody that could have been a lullaby or a hymn, or the first stumbling notes of a beginner trying to make sense of an instrument. But as the piece developed, the melody grew more complex. She was incorporating gospel, now the church music of her childhood, the songs her grandmother had sung. The left hand took on the role of a bass line, from those Sunday mornings, steady and sure, while the right hand embroidered increasingly sophisticated variations on the simple theme. This was her story. The journey from that first note in the community center basement to this moment on one of the world's great stages. Every practice session, every small victory, every moment of doubt and determination. And then the music shifted, became darker, more uncertain. This was the memory of loss, of Ms. Grant's funeral, of that last conversation where the old teacher had smiled and said, "You're ready, baby? You've always been ready?" Jordan channeled her grief into the keys. Not maudlin, not sentimental, but honest, real. The kind of sorrow that anyone who'd ever lost someone important would recognize. But sorrow wasn't the end. The piece began to transform again. The simple melody from the beginning returned, but enriched now. Deepened by everything that had come between. This wasn't the memory of what was lost. This was the memory of what remained. The lessons, the love, the foundation that could never be taken away. The final chord rang out clear and resolute. This time the silence lasted longer. When Jordan opened her eyes, she saw people in the audience wiping their eyes. Even some of the judges looked moved. The applause was different this time. Not excited or impressed. Grateful. She'd given them something real, something that touched them where they lived. Dr. Morrison spoke again. Profound. Authentic. This improvisation demonstrates not just technical facility, but emotional intelligence and narrative development. Remarkable. 2 down, 1 to go. But Jordan was exhausted. Improvisation at this level was like running a marathon while solving complex equations. Every note was a decision. Every phrase was a risk. And she still had one more theme to face. Margaret opened the 3rd envelope. Her expression shifted slightly. Was that concern? She turned to the microphone. The 3rd and final theme, Margaret announced, is freedom. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Freedom. The most abstract theme yet. The most open to interpretation. The most dangerous. Jordan felt a flutter of panic. Storm had been straightforward. Memory had been personal. But freedom. How do you improvise freedom? Then she realized that was exactly the point. Freedom was the challenge. Freedom was the risk. Freedom was letting go of all the rules and trusting yourself completely. She took a deep breath, looked out at the audience one more time, saw their expectant faces, saw Caldwell still in the front row, still watching with that inscrutable expression. And then Jordan Hayes decided to fly. Her hands hit the keys with explosive energy. This wasn't gentle. This wasn't controlled. This was chaos and joy and rebellion all at once. She threw classical structure out the window and played pure feeling. Jazz riffs collided with classical runs. Gospel shouts transformed into modern dissonance. She was breaking every rule she'd ever learned, and it was glorious. This was what freedom sounded like. Wild, unpredictable, uncontained by tradition or expectation or anyone else's definition of what piano music should be. She channeled every frustration of the past 3 months, every time someone had doubted her, every time she'd been told she didn't belong, every accusation, every cancellation, every moment of wondering if she should just give up. And she transformed all of it into defiance, into joy, into freedom. The music built and built, getting bigger and more audacious, climbing higher and higher up the keyboard, until she was playing in registers most classical music never touched, making the piano scream and sing and soar. And then, at the peak, when it seemed impossible to go any further, she brought it all crashing down in a series of powerful chords that made the hall ring. The final chord was a massive cluster that used her entire arm, every note on the keyboard singing at once, in beautiful, terrible, glorious chaos. Silence. Jordan's chest heaved, her hands shook, sweat ran down her back. Then the hall exploded. 2,400 people rose as one. The applause was deafening. People were shouting, crying. The judges themselves were on their feet. Even the stage crew in the wings were clapping. Jordan looked out at the standing ovation and felt something break inside her chest. Relief. Vindication. Joy, she'd done it. She'd proved herself. Not to Caldwell, not to the judges, to herself. She'd told her truth, and her truth had set her free. But as the applause continued, Jordan saw something that made her pause. Dr. Richard Caldwell was standing, clapping. But his face told a different story. He looked trapped, cornered. And in that moment, Jordan understood something. He'd never expected her to succeed. He'd set up this test wanting her to fail. But she hadn't failed. She'd triumphed. And now he had a problem. Because if Jordan Hayes could create music like that, in real time spontaneously with no preparation, then every accusation he'd ever made was wrong. obviously publicly wrong. And Caldwell wasn't the kind of man who admitted he was wrong. As the applause finally began to fade, as people settled back into their seats, as Margaret returned to the microphone to thank Jordan and close the performance, Jordan made a decision. She wasn't finished. Not yet. She stood up from the piano bench and walked to the center of the stage. Margaret looked confused. Ms. Hayes Jordan gestured to ask for the microphone. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret handed it to her. The hall fell silent. What was happening? This wasn't part of the program. Jordan looked out at the audience, found Caldwell's face in the front row, and then she spoke. "Thank you," Jordan said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Thank you all for being here tonight, for witnessing what I hope was an honest demonstration of original musicianship." The audience applauded briefly. Jordan waited for silence. 3 months ago, she continued my integrity as an artist was questioned. It was suggested that my work lacked originality, that I was at best derivative, at worst that I was copying others without proper attribution. Every eye in the hall was on her now. People shifted uncomfortably. This was not typical classical music gala behavior. Tonight, I hope I've proven those accusations false. I hope I've demonstrated that my musical voice is authentically mine. More applause. Jordan held up a hand. But I want to say something else, something important. Improvisation, real improvisation, is the ultimate test of originality. You can't fake it. You can't prepare it. You can't copy it. What comes out in that moment is purely undeniably you. She paused, looked directly at Caldwell. And that's why I'd like to extend an invitation. Dr. Caldwell, would you please join me on stage? The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Caldwell's face went very still. You see, Jordan continued, Dr. Caldwell was once a pianist himself, a graduate of Juilliard. He studied under some of the great masters. And I think it would be valuable for everyone here, for the classical music community, to witness improvisation from someone with his credentials, his experience, his expertise. Caldwell remained seated, frozen. Please, Dr. Caldwell, Jordan said, her voice carrying the perfect tone of respectful invitation that concealed the trap she was setting. Would you honor us with a demonstration? Just one improvisation. One theme. Show us how an expert, someone with decades of experience in evaluating musical originality, approaches spontaneous creation. The audience began to applaud, thinking it was a genuine invitation to celebrate a respected figure. The pressure mounted. Caldwell couldn't refuse without looking afraid, without looking like he had something to hide. Margaret looked between Jordan and Caldwell, understanding dawning on her face. This wasn't scripted. This was dangerous. Caldwell stood slowly. His face was composed, but Jordan saw the tightness around his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. He made his way to the stage. The applause continued, but there was uncertainty in it now. People sensed something wasn't quite right. Caldwell reached the stage. He and Jordan stood face to face for a moment. An interesting proposition, Ms. Hayes, he said quietly, so only she could hear. But unnecessary. You've proven yourself tonight. We don't need to turn this into a spectacle. Oh, I think we do, Jordan replied, her voice equally quiet. You made my artistry a spectacle for 3 months. Turnabout seems fair. His eyes narrowed. But the audience was watching. The cameras were rolling. He had no choice. Very well, he said, loud enough for the hall to hear. If it would be helpful to demonstrate the improvisational process, I'm happy to oblige. He walked to the piano, sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, placed his hands on the keys with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Margaret approached with an envelope. She looked at Jordan, then at Caldwell, clearly uncertain about what was happening, but unable to stop it now. She opened the envelope. Dr. Caldwell, your theme is truth. If Margaret had meant it as a pointed choice, her face didn't show it. But the irony wasn't lost on anyone in the hall. Truth. Caldwell's hands hovered over the keys. For just a moment, Jordan saw uncertainty flash across his face. Then he began to play. The first notes were technically perfect. Caldwell's finger technique was flawless. His posture was correct. Every aspect of his playing demonstrated years of training and practice. But something was wrong. The music was empty. It followed patterns, recognizable patterns. Jordan heard echoes of Chopin in the phrasing, elements of Debussy in the harmonies, even some Bill Evans in the chord structures. It was like listening to an algorithm generate classical music. All the right elements were there, but the soul was missing. Caldwell played for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he stopped abruptly. "This is not a fair test," he said, turning away from the piano. "Improvisation requires preparation, context, a proper environment. To ask someone to create spontaneously in front of... But that's exactly what you asked of me," Jordan interrupted, stepping forward. "Spontaneous creation. No preparation, no context, just truth expressed through music." The audience was utterly silent now. The air crackled with tension. "That was different," Caldwell said, his composure cracking slightly. "You're a performer. I'm a critic. My role is to evaluate, not to." "You were a performer," Jordan said. "That's what makes this so interesting, Dr. Caldwell. You trained as a pianist. You studied at Juilliard. You spent years learning this instrument. So why is it so difficult for you to improvise? Why does your playing sound so derivative?" Caldwell's face flushed. "That's absurd. I've never claimed to be a composer or improviser. My expertise lies in evaluating others," Jordan finished, "in determining who's authentic and who isn't, in accusing young artists of lacking originality. It's just interesting that when you're asked to demonstrate that originality yourself, you can't. Or won't. Which raises a question, doesn't it?" "What question?" Caldwell said, his voice tight. Jordan walked to center stage, addressing the entire hall now. "The question is, why would someone who can't improvise, who can't demonstrate spontaneous musical creativity, be so convinced that others can't either? Unless..." She let the word hang. "Unless what Ms. Hayes Caldwell demanded." Before Jordan could answer, one of the judges stood up. Dr. Patricia Morrison. She was looking at her tablet, scrolling through something with increasing intensity. "Margaret," she called out, "I need to show you something. Now." Margaret hurried over. Dr. Morrison showed her the tablet. Margaret's face went pale. "What is it?" someone in the audience called out. Dr. Morrison looked at Caldwell, then at Jordan, then out at the audience. During Dr. Caldwell's improvisation, she said slowly, "I thought I recognized some of the harmonic patterns, so I did a quick search on the musical analysis database. It's a tool we use to identify similarities between compositions." She paused. The hall was so quiet, you could hear breathing. Dr. Caldwell's improvisation shows significant similarity to a piece by Hungarian composer Laszlo Petrov, a relatively obscure work from 1987 called Variations on Truth. The correlation is over 90%. Gasps rippled through the audience. "That's ridiculous," Caldwell said quickly. "Similarities happen. All music draws from the same tradition, the same..." "It's not just this improvisation," Dr. Morrison continued, still scrolling. "I'm looking at other works attributed to Richard Caldwell, compositions published under your name, and I'm finding troubling patterns. This piece from 1995, very similar to a work by Russian composer Anna Kozlova. This one from 2001, remarkable similarities to a Belgian composer most people have never heard of. This arrangement from 2008. Enough!" Caldwell shouted. His composure shattered completely. This is a witch hunt. You're manufacturing evidence to the projection screen, Margaret said quietly to a technician. Suddenly, the large screens flanking the stage lit up. Side-by-side comparisons appeared. Musical notation on one side from Caldwell's published works. On the other side, scores from obscure composers, many of them European, many of them published in limited circulation, easy to appropriate if you thought no one would notice. The similarities were damning. "You've been doing exactly what you accused me of," Jordan said, her voice steady. "Except worse. You weren't influenced by these composers. You didn't draw inspiration from them. You copied them, wholesale, and then published their work under your name." Caldwell stood frozen at the piano, his face ashen. "And when you saw me," Jordan continued, "when you heard my playing and recognized real originality, something you'd never been able to achieve yourself, you panicked. Because if people started looking too closely at creativity, at what makes original music original, they might start looking at your own work. So you attacked me first, projected your own fraud onto me." "This is insane," Caldwell said weakly. But his voice had no conviction. Everyone in the hall could see the truth written on his face. Dr. Morrison was still scrolling. "There are more. Margaret, we're going to need to do a full investigation, if even a fraction of these correlations hold up." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Richard Caldwell, the most powerful critic in classical music, the man who'd made and broken careers for 3 decades, stood exposed, not just as wrong about Jordan Hayes, but as a fraud himself. Caldwell looked out at the audience, at the judges, at the evidence displayed on the screens, at Jordan standing there with quiet dignity, having proven herself while simultaneously, perhaps unintentionally, destroying him. Without another word, he walked off the stage. The side door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow carried through the entire silent hall. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of what had just happened was too enormous to process. Then someone in the balcony started clapping. Slowly at first. Then others joined. And within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet again. Not for Richard Caldwell, for Jordan Hayes. For truth. Jordan stood alone on the stage, the applause washing over her like waves. But she felt curiously numb. She hadn't planned this. She'd only wanted to clear her name. She'd never expected to uncover Caldwell's own deception. Margaret approached, spoke into her ear over the applause. "You need to come with me, now. Press is going to want statements. This is going to be enormous." Jordan nodded, let herself be guided off stage. Behind her, the audience continued applauding, but she could also hear the buzz of conversation, of phones being pulled out of the news, spreading in real time across social media. Backstage was chaos. Competition organizers huddled in concerned groups. The other judges gathered around Dr. Morrison's tablet, scrolling through more comparisons. A PR representative was already on the phone, presumably with lawyers. Margaret led Jordan to a quiet room away from the commotion. "Are you okay?" Jordan sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with her. "I don't know. I just wanted to prove I wasn't a fraud. I didn't mean to." "You didn't do anything wrong," Margaret said firmly. Caldwell did this to himself. "You just had the courage to ask a simple question, and the database did the rest." "What happens now?" Margaret sighed. "Investigation. Formal inquiry. If even half of those correlations are accurate, Caldwell's entire body of work will be scrutinized. Publications will retract his articles. Institutions will distance themselves. His career is over, Jordan. Finished." Jordan thought about that. 3 months ago, she would have been thrilled at the idea of Caldwell's downfall. But now, sitting in this quiet room, she felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. "And what happens to me?" she asked quietly. Margaret smiled. You just became one of the most talked about pianists in the world. You proved your authenticity in the most dramatic way possible. Every venue that canceled on you is going to be calling. Trust me. Margaret was right. The story exploded across not just classical music publications, but mainstream news outlets. Acclaimed music critic exposed as plagiarist by artist. He accused ran the headline in the New York Times. CNN did a segment. NPR interviewed several musicologists who confirmed the database findings. Within 48 hours, the Classical Music Journal announced a full investigation into all of Caldwell's published works. By the end of the week, they'd identified more than 30 instances of substantial copying from obscure sources. Caldwell issued one statement through a lawyer claiming the similarities were coincidental and the result of common musical language. No one believed him. He resigned from all his positions, boards, committees, advisory roles. His books were pulled from publication. 3 decades of influence evaporated in days. For Jordan, the vindication was swift and complete. The venues that had canceled her dates called back apologetic and eager to rebook. The recording label that had backed out suddenly wanted to fast-track a contract. Sponsors who'd withdrawn support returned offering more money than before. But the most meaningful message came in an email from Patricia Morrison, the Juilliard professor, who'd been judging that night. Dear Ms. Hayes, I want you to know that what happened at the gala was extraordinary, but not surprising to those of us who've been paying attention. Your playing has always been original. What you did took courage. Most of us will never have. You didn't just defend yourself, you defended the integrity of our entire field. On behalf of musicians everywhere, thank you. Also, we'd like to offer you a faculty position at Juilliard. If you're interested in teaching, we'd be honored to have you. Jordan read the email 3 times. A faculty position at Juilliard. Her, the girl from the South Side who'd learned on a beaten-up upright in a community center basement. 6 weeks after the gala, Jordan Hayes gave her first major concert in the aftermath. Carnegie Hall. Sold out. The concert was a mix of classical standards and her own improvisations, including new versions of Storm Memory and Freedom. But before she played, she spoke to the audience. I want to dedicate tonight's performance to my teacher, Ms. Dorothy Grant, who believed in me when I was 7 years old and never stopped believing. She taught me that music is truth and that truth cannot be copied. Your truth is yours alone. She paused, looking out at the packed hall. What happened 6 weeks ago was not a victory for me over Dr. Caldwell. It was a reminder that authenticity matters. That originality isn't about being completely unlike anyone who came before you. That's impossible. We all learn from each other. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. But the way we combine those influences, the unique perspective we bring, the truth we express through our art that's ours, that can't be stolen or faked. The audience applauded. Jordan sat at the Steinway. Ms. Grant used to tell me that every musician has a voice. Finding that voice is the work of a lifetime. But once you find it, once you know what your truth sounds like, no one can take it away from you. Tonight, I'm going to share my voice with you. Not because it's the best voice or the most important voice, just because it's mine. She placed her fingers on the keys. And that's enough. The concert that followed was transcendent. Critics called it one of the finest performances of the year. But more than that, they noted something they'd always heard in Jordan's playing, but could now articulate: honesty, courage, truth. After the concert, Jordan didn't attend the after-party. Instead, she took a cab to the south side of Chicago. The community center on 47th Street looked exactly the same. A little older, a little more run down, but fundamentally unchanged. Jordan pushed open the door, and made her way to the basement. The old upright piano was still there. A teenage boy was playing, stumbling through a Mozart sonata. A young teacher Jordan didn't recognize was offering corrections encouragement. Jordan waited until they finished the lesson. The teacher looked up, did a double take. "Oh my God, you're Jordan Hayes." "I am." Jordan smiled. "I used to take lessons here. A long time ago. I know," the teacher said, awestruck. "There's a plaque on the wall about you and Ms. Grant." Jordan hadn't known about the plaque. The teacher showed her. It was simple brass mounted near the piano. Dorothy Grant taught here for 30 years. Her student Jordan Hayes learned to play on this piano. Jordan's eyes stung with tears. "Ms. Grant would be proud of you," the teacher said. "What you did standing up for yourself like that, standing up for all of us." "She always said music doesn't lie," Jordan replied. She was right. The teenage student had been watching shyly. Now he approached. Could you play something? Please." Jordan looked at the old upright, the same piano where she'd learned her first scales, where Ms. Grant had taught her that music was truth. She sat down. The keys were familiar under her fingers, like greeting an old friend. She played one of the first pieces Ms. Grant had ever taught her, a simple Bach prelude. But she played it with everything she'd learned in the 20 years since, with all the joy and pain and triumph and defeat she'd experienced. She played it with her voice, her truth. When she finished, the small basement was silent. The teenage student was crying. "How did you do that?" he whispered. "It's the same piece I'm learning, but when you play it, it sounds like me," Jordan finished. "That's what you have to find. Not how to play like me or like anyone else. How to play like you." She stood up from the piano, touched the plaque on the wall one more time. "Keep practicing," she told the boy. "Keep searching for your voice. And when you find it, don't let anyone tell you it's not real." A year later, Jordan Hayes released her first album. It was titled Truth and featured a mix of classical pieces and original improvisations, including the 3 pieces from that night at the Chicago Symphony Center. In the liner notes, she wrote, "This album is dedicated to Ms. Dorothy Grant, who taught me that music is the language of truth. And to everyone who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter, or isn't authentic, or doesn't belong. Your truth cannot be copied. Your voice cannot be stolen. It's yours, and it's enough." The album went on to win a Grammy. Jordan was invited to perform at the White House, at major concert halls around the world, at music festivals and conservatories. She accepted the faculty position at Juilliard and began teaching the next generation of pianists. She never saw or heard from Richard Caldwell again. Rumors circulated that he'd moved to Europe, that he was working as a music consultant under a different name. But his career as a critic, as an authority, was over. His legacy wasn't the decades of reviews he'd written, but the cautionary tale of what happens when you project your own insecurities onto others. Years later, when Jordan was asked in an interview about that night at the Chicago Symphony Center, about the moment that changed everything, she said, "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's career. I just wanted to prove I was real. But in asking Caldwell to demonstrate what he'd demanded of me, I accidentally revealed a larger truth. The people who are quickest to question others' authenticity are often hiding their own lack of it. Real artists don't need to tear down other artists. They're too busy creating." She paused, smiled. Ms. Grant used to say that music doesn't lie. She was right. But it's not just music. Truth doesn't lie. And eventually, one way or another, the truth comes out. That night it came out through music. My music. my voice, my truth. The interviewer asked one final question. If you could go back and change anything about that experience, would you? Jordan thought for a long moment. No, she finally said. Because it taught me the most important lesson of all. Your authenticity is your power. When you know who you are, when you're secure in your own voice, no one can touch you. They can attack you. They can doubt you. They can try to break you. But if you stay true to yourself, if you keep telling your truth, you'll not only survive, you'll thrive. She smiled a smile that held all the wisdom of her journey from that dusty community center basement to the world's greatest stages. And that's a lesson worth learning, even if it costs you everything to learn it.